Welcome to the Using the Whole Whale podcast, where we learn from leaders about new ideas and digital strategies making a difference in the social impact world. This podcast is a proud production of Whole Whale, a B Corp digital agency. Thank you for joining us. Now, let's go learn something. This week on the nonprofit news feed, we're talking about a national volunteer shortage as it rolls out and continues. Nick, how's it going?
It's going good, George. How are you?
First week of July. We're in the, I guess that means the second half of the year. We're doing it.
We're doing it. We're now in Q3.
Oh, everything's going to look brighter, shinier, and better. Forget Q1 and Q2 of this year. They were junk. Things are going to be completely new and fresh. And a lot of nonprofits starting their new fiscal years. So, you can replan based on the new information.
Absolutely. I'm bullish on the success of Q3, but let's go right into it. Our first story comes as we talk about an increasing trend, which is a national volunteer shortage that's threatening the stability of nonprofit programming. So as reported by Axios, nonprofits in Arizona in particular are having a hard time getting volunteers to come back compared to pre-COVID times. And while this represents a broader trend, the article talks about how nonprofits like the Ronald McDonald House Charities of Central and Northern Arizona say they may have to stop providing meals because of increased costs and lack of volunteers. Some of the contributing factors are potentially higher gas prices, coupled with fewer work-associated volunteer events, as well as, of course, remaining concerns about COVID that may have contributed to the decrease in the first place. So just a small anecdote, but from a trend that we've been tracking for a while that we know is occurring nationally. George, what's your thoughts on this?
We talked about this early with Volunteer Match as well. The CEO, Greg Baldwin, at the time of saying, like, what are you seeing? And it was clear that there were a lot more opportunities being posted than there were people necessarily filling them. And to continue that into this year, corporate volunteering, right? What does it mean when we're not all in the office together, doing things together, local and community? What does it look like over time as we have maybe moved away from central areas in certain communities? As part of the work from home, the second order effects are pretty real, where maybe people are staying inside or staying more local more often because of gas. Like, all of those things add up. And then unfortunately, we see a few of these stories. There's certainly many more. There's another one in the California reporting where they are saying, like, a local animal shelter not having enough volunteers. So if you see these stories as we do, we kind of pull them together and say, like, there are some second order effects there.
Yeah, absolutely. Something we'll continue to follow, but just wanted to call out again as one of those bigger trends we like to talk about on this podcast.
Yeah. The other piece, when you have fewer volunteers, a volunteer is, and this comes from the data inside of Volunteer Match, 10 times more likely to donate than somebody who's not volunteered. So as you approach Q4, knowing when you're supposed to be getting and converting donors in particular at higher numbers, this can have that type of downstream effect as well on mid to small nonprofits with high volunteer dependencies and relationships, that if your volunteer numbers are lagging, so too will probably your donation numbers when it comes that time of year.
Definitely. All right, George, shall we move into the summary?
Please.
All right. Our first story is kind of a wild one, and this comes from the New York Times. The title of this article is 76 Fake Charities Shared a Mailbox. The IRS kept approving more. So it turns out this dude in Staten Island kept on registering fake nonprofits, but kept getting them approved by the IRS. So this guy's registered nonprofits that don't exist, such as the United Way of Ohio, which he registered out of Staten Island, the American Cancer Society of Michigan, which was also registered out of Staten Island, and did this 70 to 80 times, getting IRS approval each time. This is just one of those classic, fascinating New York characters. He was kind of has a history of some shady Wall Street pump and dump schemes in the 80s, worked with an associate of the Gambino crime family, and now is living in Manhattan. The reporters talked to him, and he says that he regrets it and is now on the right path now. But the IRS approved these charities, which is pretty incredible. And yeah, I guess this goes back to our story of not all nonprofits are good, but he ultimately did defraud people of approximately 150,000 in donations to these fake charities. That's what they were for fraudulently, siphoning donations away from legitimate charities like the American Cancer Society. Yeah, kind of a wild tale. What's your takeaway here, George?
Just to reiterate the statement that is almost a mantra here at Wholeware, where it is just because you have a 501c3 does not mean you are doing good in this world. And this is testament. So making sure that as a donor, you're checking the validity of the organization you're donating to is crucial. But also, here's a powerful reminder for every nonprofit, especially those that rely on brand, national brand, and reputation. These are things that probably should have come up in a reputation defense, search, and monitoring that should probably go on. If you're the United Way, you should have an eye on this. If you're an American Cancer organization, you should have an eye on organizations that are popping up and looking to essentially mislead donors with brand adjacent and sort of mimicking your brand IP. And you work hard to create it. You should also spend capital, time, money, whatever you want to put towards that. You should spend that toward analyzing whether or not there are these types of scams in there, and file those cease and desist letters and notices through there. The other piece here, which kind of resounded a little disturbingly on the nose for me, is the quote that he had here is, "If you file something with an agency," he said, "and they approve it, do you think it's illegal?" So technically, I guess the approving of it happened. The IRS looked at it, said yup, that looks right 72 freaking times. Okay. The part where you get into illegal is raising funds under somebody else's name. That's runs a butt of false advertising, misrepresentation, and fraud.
Yeah, absolutely. And George, just back to your point about, that brand protection and awareness piece. This is a little less sinister, but might be a tangible piece of information for our listeners, is that every organization should Google themselves in a search engine and see what comes up. Because if you're a larger or medium or larger size organization, there is a chance that a competitor organization is bidding against you in terms of advertising. And again, a little bit different. This is obviously all kosher. It's not illegal. It's a strategy. But when it comes to brand protection, that's an important thing to do. How do you show up in Google search? How do you appear on the internet? Are there organizations with similar names that are kind of milking that similarity for what it's worth, and that kind of stuff is important. So I think you bring up a really good point. Even if it's totally above board and legitimate, still important to know who your competitors are and what they're doing.
Yeah. And as if you didn't have enough things to do, but there was real money associated with this, right? There's $152,000 that didn't find its way to those handful of charities. So what is the cost of not doing brand defense? You tell me.
Wise words. All right, I'll take us into our next story. And this one is about a nonprofit calling out Tesla for not disclosing enough environmental data. Tesla, of course, one of the most traded and talked about companies on Wall Street, is being called out by an organization called CDP, which is a global nonprofit that runs an environmental disclosure system for companies, cities, states, and regions. And they've called out Tesla for not disclosing the environmental impact of their company, along with other major companies that are traded. Tesla got actually downgraded off of the S&P 500's ESG index last year, which is the Environmental, Social, and Governance Index, which is supposed to be, presumably socially and environmentally conscious companies. And they actually got kicked off that list last year, much to the chagrin of the company's current chief executive. This is kind of interesting. And I think it's important and goes into the narrative that nonprofits have a power and a legitimacy to call out companies that need to improve their practices for social and environmental reasons. And that this is getting picked up, I think is definitely a good thing. We only need more accountability, not less.
What I like about CDP is also that they are essentially leveraging corporate markets and structure to improve disclosures with regard to environmental impacts in a very real way. This isn't just a article published over here on the side. This actually affects the way that your company is listed, which matters very much when you're talking about how fund distributions work and how, we mentioned ESG fund investing works. And I picked up on the story because I remember Elon Musk, as with many things, moaning on Twitter, as he's wont to do, about how organizations like Exxon are on an ESG list, but yet Tesla has fallen off. And frankly, I was wondering how that happened. And here you go. They aren't disclosing how the organization is impacting and has an environmental footprint. And I think it's important to note because on the surface, they have revolutionized and moved forward by orders of probably decades, the electric car movement in America. However, to just tell that story and not also talk about the net effects of lithium mining internationally and what that actually means in the environment is a misstep. You sort of assume you've solved the problem by not looking at the process. And so I think a full disclosure of what that mineral extraction costs is important. Are we trading one evil for another, and to what level? So you ain't on the list, go disclose.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a case of don't let perfect be the enemy of good. But transparency is still important, right? So I totally agree with that take. All right. Our next story is that W3C is announcing plans to launch or relaunch as a nonprofit organization. So W3C has to do with internet standards and governance, and they're relaunching as a nonprofit. George, I'm just going to toss this over to you.
I just have a soft spot I grew up with looking at W3C training and learning materials and how they've guided the fundamental underpinnings of HTML and CSS, the things that make your websites bright, poppy, sparkly, and friendly enough. It just is been a tremendous organization just in, sort of my journey in web. And I like seeing them turn to the social good from the for-profit to the nonprofit. W3C was originally founded in 1994 by Tim Berners-Lee, widely credited as the principal web inventor, much to the chagrin of others, claiming internet authority.
Yeah, it's actually honestly amazing how much these kind of small organizations that most people have never heard of contribute so much to the infrastructure of the internet.
If you talk about accessibility, right? Like web accessibility standards that have allowed and made sure that folks that have issues with colorblindness or interested in web readers, and the standards that have allowed a true diversity of individuals ranging of ability to access the web and its information. These are the folks that are helping look out for those as well.
Absolutely. All right. Shall I take us into our next story? All right. This one is a little controversial. I'll put it out there. This was an opinion in the New York Times. And the opinion is that Democrats are having a purity test problem at exactly the wrong time. And the title, I think, is slightly misleading. And the reason it's included on this summary is because it largely talks about progressive nonprofits and civil society groups, and generally nonprofits and activist groups within the left. And the general thesis of this opinion is that there is a lot of tension between older, potentially more traditional, but also still liberal leaders of these organizations and younger, more diverse up and coming people in this organization who are pushing for change more aggressively than their older counterparts. And this particular opinion is that that tension is causing turmoil at these organizations. And this is a point of view. It's an opinion, but it's certainly an interesting thing to chew on. And I know we previously talked about a story here where the ACLU was kind of at this center of fierce protection of civil liberties, which doesn't always necessarily align with progressive ideas and values, as just one kind of anecdote. But George, what's your takeaway from this opinion? What should nonprofits be thinking about? Because whether or not you agree with this opinion or not, I'm sure that this is coming up in some way or another at tons of organizations.
First off, this is a difficult issue, and to not talk about what any sort of policy brought and implemented to at an extreme or even in the wrong way, and its net potential negative effects is a misstep. So I don't know if this particular article nails all of it in the right way, but I think it's an interesting conversation to have, and it does actually call in a lot of actual quotes from actual leaders. And, I'll try to find one particular quote. They talked through this Ryan Grimm's June 13th Intercept piece, Elephant in the Room, Meltdowns have brought the progressive advocacy groups to a standstill at a critical moment in the world's history. And so this assessment, as mentioned, touches on the ACLU. They mention the Guttmacher Institute. They talk to some people who are only were anonymously talking about the issue. And in one part, just to quote this article, a consultant who works primarily for nonprofit advocacy groups, only spoke anonymously, mentioned that in this quote, she said, regularly sees routine disputes over salaries and assignments, quote, turned into civil rights issues, making them extremely difficult to resolve under ordinary circumstances. The failure to give someone a raise, even when it is a black boss, becomes a matter of structural racism, she said. And it continues on with these sort of anecdotal points, I think, to try to prove a macro narrative that I personally need to see more data around. However, with that, a number of citations in these issues in well-known organizations that are clearly cherry-picked, there can be a kernel of truth where there is a sort of paralyzing inefficiency to the way that DEI might be sadly weaponized in certain situations where it doesn't need to be. And whenever you misuse something, you're actually doing a greater disservice to your true end goal than implementing it in the right way. But I think there's a kernel of truth here where I think there are a lot of progressive organizations struggling with maintaining their mission with a higher expectation of DEI, DEIB in the organization in the way they do work. And that's not just from senior level, but also it sounds like in the junior level of how you communicate these things without weaponizing them to the detriment of the organization's outcomes. It's a complex issue, but to not talk about it, like you brought it in, you're like, oh, I don't know if we should pull it in. And I was like, this is fascinating and maybe an important conversation and way for you to take this article and send it to your organization and be like, what do we think? Is there anything here?
Yeah, George, I think that's an interesting take. And kind of like the other side of this is they talk about how there's this tension between kind of the institutional structure of an organization and new people who are coming in to create change. And it talks about how just a lot of these organizations are undergoing really rapid change very quickly. And that in and of itself is potentially just bringing kind of these issues to the surface, and something that a lot of institutions are wrangling right now. I think some people would say for the better, some people would say to the detriment of mission, right? But either way, I think a really important opinion here. Definitely, again, that an opinion, but interesting conversation nonetheless.
And I am trying to also keep an eye on whether or not we're talking about the perennial generational shift in work and power that plays out, frankly, every 20, 30 years versus are people just using at the executive level or at the opinion level, DEI as the broad brush for saying like, hey, guess what? There's a generational power struggle happening. And this is just the way that we're going to paint it as a narrative. And so I try to see as best I can. However, I think I'm probably too close to the problem. Speaking as somebody who straddles as an elder millennial in it.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things in there, and George, this is not you, but it said that boomers are the whitest generation in American history, and it talks about how whiteness as a racial identity wasn't really cohesive until the boomers generation, right? 100 years ago, it wasn't "Are you white?" It was "Are you Italian? Are you Irish?" And of course, there's a lot of tension there. But that organization, that generation is some of the least diverse, and Gen Z is the most diverse. And it talks about that imbalance now that Gen Z is entering the workforce. And it's actually kind of really interesting. There's lots of articles about Gen Z, even on kind of less challenging issues, like about, offices versus open floor plans that are coming into question. It's kind of interesting to see out. I think there is kind of a shift happening, but interesting to say the least. All right, George, we've waited for this moment for so long. How about a feel-good story?
Did we actually do it? Did we find feel-good stories? And I didn't let you down on my job?
No, we found a feel-good story. This one comes from the New Haven Register, and it talks about how 10 years after launch, a nonprofit in Hamden has repaired 173 homes for veterans, which is incredible. Veteran homelessness is one of the saddest and kind of most ingrained problems in this country. But it talks about in this article how one veteran and the nonprofit is really working to help folks kind of get a leg up when it comes to housing. The organization is called House of Heroes, and they do really great work. So just wanted to highlight an organization doing awesome work.
173 houses is awesome, and especially coming off of July 4th, where we celebrate our nation's heroes and the people that have lost their lives for our freedoms. It is a great nonprofit doing great things, so hats off to them. A little quote we ended with, I'll just shout it. The most difficult thing is the decision to act. The rest is merely tenacity. Amelia Earhart. So I like this mindset of, especially when things are maybe frustrating, when you feel like there's too many problems, remember the difficult thing is that first step, and then it's about execution. So great words from a great woman. All right, Nick, see you out there. Thanks for the ongoing support and reporting.
Of course. Talk next week.
This has been Using the Whole Whale podcast. If you want to keep learning more about these topics and others, head on over to wholewhale.com/university to keep learning with us. Thanks as always to GregThomasMusic.org for his tunes that underwrite our tracks. They're fantastic. Hope you're doing well, Greg. And just a reminder, subscribes really help us on any platform that you listen to us on. Please give a thought to click and subscribe, and maybe even a comment, because we like hearing from you.